All right, Leviticus 19. We're going to try to hit 19 through verse 9 of chapter 20. I had a little typo in the class material. It's supposed to be 20 verses 1 through 9, not just verse 9. Hopefully you guys figured that one out. And then we'll get into chapters 12 and 13, trying to get into physical, bodily holiness and what that definition is. So, in chapter 19, we began our discussion of civic holiness. This is the holiness that is directed to the people of Israel themselves, rather than just specifically to Levites or specifically to priests. As we've discussed through the majority of this, not a lot of Leviticus is devoted to normal Jews. Most of it is devoted to, or at the very minimum, slanted toward priesthood and what their responsibility is in regards to keeping the people holy. So in the first 8 verses of chapter 19, we looked at religious holiness, making sure that you are honoring your father and your mother, keeping the Sabbaths, not making idols, and using your peace offerings the way that they're supposed to be used. We started looking at more, what's the word I want to use? More community rules. From verse 9 down through where we're going to start in verse 15. Not reaping everything in your fields, not stealing from each other or lying about each other, but preserving that relationship. Not oppressing your neighbor, making sure that you're paying the workers when you're supposed to be paying them as well. So we talked about each of those. We talked about that responsibility towards the people who live near you because, one, they're probably family, which means they're not moving away. Even if they do move away, they got to come back in the year of Jubilee. So keep these relationships good. Keep that society functioning as appropriately as it can. So in verse 15, let's go ahead and continue on. He says, "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people. You shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord." So we'll stop there. In the court systems, people always have fallen on either side of this. Either society values the wealthy and they can buy their way out of anything, or they're so against the wealthy that a poor person could go into your house, steal everything, and murder you and get away with it. Read history. You're going to see both of those in here. And God says that's not the way it's supposed to be. Their socioeconomic status is not relevant here. The only thing that is truly relevant is what happened and what God says about it. Because notice that they are supposed to be judging in righteousness against their neighbors. So because you don't like them as a person, you can't go around slandering them. You still have to be righteous, even if they irk you, even if they irritate you, even if they grate on your very soul. You still have to be righteous near them. If you're going to say something, say it privately to your wife, never in public, never to anyone else, because pillow talk is a whole separate issue. Do not stand up against the life of your neighbor. It's coupled with slandering here. Don't try to get your neighbor killed off. What's the advantage of killing off your neighbor in a Jewish society? You get the land. Kill off that family, that land is up for grabs. So you can absorb it into yours so that it is still within the family, or it's within the greater clan, or within the greater tribe. So yeah, we're talking about money. I mean, that's really what's coming down to, is getting the money out of that. In 17, he says, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." He says, don't hate your brother in your heart, but reason with him. I love that. Those are paired together. Do we have any different translations for that? This is the ESV. Let me hear one.
Hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share his guilt.
Okay. Little bit of a different twist on it. Still the same point. You have a choice here, whether your neighbor has sinned or not, depending upon if you're, what are you reading from? I'm putting you on the spot here. I'm reading out of the ESV, NIV. So NIV takes more of the slant that the neighbor has sinned. ESV takes a little bit more of the slant that you are the one who is going to sin, and they may not have, just by how it's worded. Any of them take it a little bit of different, yeah. New American Standard? Yeah.
Your fellow countryman in your heart, you may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him.
Okay. So that one takes much similar stance to the ESV, that they may or may not have sinned, but they did do something that makes you hate them. Like, that is pretty clear. You don't like your neighbor for a variety of reasons that your imagination is already filling in. You know why someone wouldn't like their neighbor. But you cannot sin just because you don't like them. That's the point here. Whether they have truly sinned against you, you can't join in their sin by sinning as well. Or they haven't sinned against you, you can't join in the wrongness, adding sin to non-sin. You can't do that. Instead, you talk to them, and you figure out how to live with each other. That's the whole point of 17 and even 18, not taking vengeance, not bearing a grudge, but instead learning to love your neighbor, learning to get along, learning to live next to each other for the next 65 years until one of you blessedly dies. You got to figure out how to do it. Any comments anybody has on that section? Yeah.
Just doing a quick word search.
It's a quick word search.
Yeah. So this the whole section here on love your neighbor as yourself. When Jesus is speaking on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, he does say there, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then he also says, and you've also heard, hate your enemy. Mm-hmm. And if we're not careful, there it is. Yeah, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I think sometimes we think, okay, God has said X, therefore the opposite of X must also be true, and it's not.
Yeah.
Because the opposite of love your neighbor is hate your enemy. So that we can define, because I would not want to accidentally love my enemy, because that goes against the command.
Right. He's not my neighbor.
He's not my neighbor. And so I think that's a great place for us to look sometimes and say, you know what? Am I trying to make distinctions that the scriptures don't make, or am I trying to say the opposite of whatever is said is all is true, and when it's not?
Yeah, very good point. Very good. It's a good reminder. Great to bring Christ into that discussion, because that is one of his pillars. Love your neighbor as yourself. Like, that's on this one and one other hinges the entirety of the law. So yeah. Yeah.
Equal to your friends and everything, or could that mean a little less love for your friends and people real close?
By context, I think this love is loving enough to get along with. So you might prefer some people more than other people, but you still can't take vengeance on your neighbor just because you don't like them, or even because you hate them with your very soul. You still can't take vengeance. You still can't bear a grudge. You still got to figure out how to live in such a way that you can love your neighbor, because it says something about you. Notice God turns it in verse 17. You're the one incurring sin because of him, or with him, or joining in that sin, depending upon how yours is worded. But the point is you're going to sin too if you're not careful. It's a good comment.
You know, a thought that occurred to me is it's just as wrong to defer to the rich and powerful as it is to snub the poor.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't go either way. You're supposed to respect both of them. And in fact, the first chapter of Deuteronomy tells us that you're not to show partiality to anybody. Treat everybody the same. Treat them well.
Yeah.
Love them all.
James makes the same point for us. Yeah. Okay, let's read the next section here. 19 through the end of the chapter. I don't really have a good heading for this section. It's kind of like other stuff. Some of it is very specific to individuals. Some of it is religiously oriented, idolatry oriented. Well, you'll see as we're reading along through here. In 19, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two different kinds of seed. You shall not wear a garment of cloth made of two different kinds of material. So the rule number one here is no mixing. That's the point. He makes the same rules when he says when you get into the land, don't marry the women of the land. When you're wandering for 40 years, don't marry the foreign women. I mean, it's the same rule being made. You are a pure people. You're going to stand apart because you don't do these mixings. You don't take one breed and another. You don't take two different kinds of seeds and try to put them into the same field. You don't take two different kinds of fabrics and try to put them into the same garment. You make them pure. And it's a comment on their holiness. They are separate in all things. They are separate in their garments. They're separate in their livestock. They're separate in their behaviors from the rest of the nations. All right, in 20. If a man lies sexually with a woman who is a slave assigned to another man and yet not ransomed or given her freedom, a distinction shall be made. They shall not be put to death because she was not free. But he shall bring his compensation to the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram for a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord for his sin that he has committed. He shall be forgiven of the sin that he has committed. Okay, so we're going to add in here. What is the normal law if a man lies with a woman he's not married to? What's the normal law? Death. A little bit of leeway for if it happens in the field versus in the city, but in the city it's death. Death for both, they're just dead. There's nothing more. However, he makes a distinction with a slave. I talked about this last time. The ancient world viewed slavery a little different than we do because we're on this side of the Civil War. And this side of the African slave trade. They had an African slave trade too, but it was different. Just read about it. And so to them, a slave is different. They are a lower class. They are considered as one who is dead. And so really they are without rights. They're without protections under most societies. God gives them some protections and some rights. However, here is one of those that we would say is probably not the greatest of rights, but it is in God's law, so I'm not going to call it immoral. Otherwise, I'm calling God immoral. I can't do that. So what he says here is that if a man lies with a woman who is a slave, who is not free, who has not been given any kinds of freedom or ransom or anything like that, the distinction is she was not free to make her own choices. She is a possession. He utilized a possession, but he still also had sex with someone that he's not supposed to be having sex with. So he is sinning. Note the kind of sacrifice that is used. What's the kind? A guilt offering. We're not talking about him being just unclean. That might be a sin offering. This is a guilt offering. He has intentionally chosen to do something that is against the commands. He offers his guilt offering before the Lord. He brings his ram. He makes atonement. The priest does. He shall be forgiven of his sin that he has committed. Any comments on that? Same point. Concubine is a really nice way of saying slave. Like the majority of the time in Scripture. It's a translator not wanting to put the word slave. That's the vast majority of the...
Wanting to put sex slave.
Yes. Yes. But even with Solomon talking about concubines, they're going to be sex slaves. That's what they are.
I think really in this instance, concubine is more what is inferred, the way we understand the word concubine, because it actually says a slave acquired for another man.
Yeah.
The inference is that she was purposed for another man for that reason.
Yeah.
And he took advantage of her when she wasn't his.
So an example would be Absalom with David's concubines.
Perfect, yep.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? There's a lot of fault in that story. A lot of fault in that story. That's plenty to move around. Okay, let's get to 23. When you come into the land and plant any kind of tree for food, then you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years it will be forbidden you, it must not be eaten. In the 4th year all of its fruit shall be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. In the 5th year you may eat of its fruit, to increase its yield for you. For I am the Lord your God. So another new rule, kind of modifying some of the other things we've talked about. He's already talked about when you come into the land, you're supposed to let the land rest for a certain amount of time. That's a separate one. We've talked about the 7 years with the Sabbaths. That's another one. This is a different purpose. So what do you do if you're trying to plant new trees? What are you doing if you're trying to plant new fruit trees, fruit-bearing trees in your land? For 3 years, you consider it as forbidden. Nobody uses it for anything. Now, what that means is that you're not tithing off of it either. You're not bringing it as first fruits, because it isn't first fruits. It's no fruits. It's fruits falling to the ground, eaten by whatever livestock perhaps happen to go there, but you're not using it even intentionally for that. It's nothing. Then, in the 4th year, all of its fruit is holy. It is an offering of praise to the Lord. This is when you're going to start bringing it as first fruits. This is when you're going to start bringing it with your offerings. But you still are not eating it. Now, that could mean, because some of the scholars argued with each other, so I'm going to tell you both. It could mean that what that means is that everything that comes off the tree, you give to the tabernacle. Some interpret it that way. Some interpreted it that now you use it for the holy things, like first fruits, or bringing it as part of your sacrifices with certain ones, but everything else falls to the ground and is considered forbidden. It could be that too. You guys can decide for yourself. It's one line. I mean, they're arguing over the one line. But it could be either one. Any comments anybody has on that?
Trees do not bear heavily till the 5th year. In the groves that we had, in the 5th year you expected a bushel.
Yeah.
Before that, it wasn't worth picking. And I'm just wondering if God's not saying, okay, this is going to be new. You need to stay away from it. You've got plenty of trees from the Canaanites you took over. Let these things kind of get their ground and they'll produce for you.
Yeah.
It's a blessing.
And like many of the laws, there is a very practical reason as well. There's a very spiritual reason for this as well. You got to wait 5 years, trusting that God will keep this tree here for 5 years. That's a lot of faith. If that happens to fall on a Sabbath year or coming up on Jubilee, that was poor planting. You should have planned a little better. Any comments? Okay. And yes, that was intended to be a pun. Thank you for those who joked. 26. You shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it. You shall not interpret omens or tell fortunes. You shall not round off the hair of your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourself. I am the Lord. So this section here from 26 down through 31 is dealing with religiously oriented things. So when he's describing here in 26, 27, and 28, and he's going to describe it in the next few, are things that were commonly done for idolatry purposes. Things like marring of your body, cutting on your body for religious things. I mean, that's literally what happens in the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, right? They're cutting their flesh. They're screaming out, trying to get the attention of Baal. Tattooing yourself for the religious purposes. They're not allowed to do that either. They can't round off the hair of their temples or mar the edges of their beard to make them look a certain way, which several of the idol worshippers would have done. They can't eat the flesh with blood in it, which probably is referencing a ritual, because he's already dealt with don't eat blood of any kind. If you've got blood coming out of an animal, it's either happening at the tabernacle or you are mixing it with the ground. Like, it's going to be disgusting. So he's already dealt with that. This one here is talking about during a ritual. So you've killed the animal, and in the process, you're eating the raw flesh, perhaps to gain the power of the animal. It was very common in paganism. Perhaps just to add into the divining. After all, the very next sentence is interpreting omens or telling of fortunes. So trying to gain that spiritual side, to gain some magic, to gain some power over the natural things in order to tell the future or to tell what they're supposed to do, what the will of the gods is. So it's kind of a gross section, but this is what idolatry worship comes down to. Yeah?
Explain verse 27.
Do I want to have Clay explain verse 27?
Don't cut your beard.
Yes. Their beards were long and luxurious, and when we talk about the section over leprosy, there's going to be several beard comments coming through there.
Josh has rounded the corners of his beard.
I've rounded it pretty hard. 29. Any other comment? What? Yeah.
What, do you think you can apply that today?
I hesitate any time to apply the law of Moses till today. Yeah. That's my answer on that. I'm going to stick with it. 29. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land fall into prostitution and the land be full of depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So notice the orientation here. We're still in the section that is talking about other religious thought. I'm going to word it that way because the next one gets real far into other religious thoughts, even departing further from our idea of rigid religious idolatry. But it's giving your daughter over to be a temple prostitute is really the point he's getting across. It's not just turning her loose at the city gates to greet the men who are coming in. It's not just sending her out into the countryside to make a little extra money with the shepherds. That's not really what his point is. His point is giving her over to temple worship so that she brings honor and glory to the family because she is serving as a temple prostitute. Note the connections coming in here. The land itself falls into prostitution and the land becomes full of depravity. There is one thing the ancient world has proven, is that when there are women who are willing to have sex cheaply, the land falls into depravity because men walk right into that trap every day. Proverbs makes the same arguments. You can watch the fall of Rome and see the same arguments, is that when sex is free and easy and available everywhere, depravity follows, and the land just becomes disgusting, and then it usually is destroyed, and then another nation comes in. It's a good warning, perhaps, for our nation. Notice his response to this. Rather than giving your daughter over to the worships of idols, the practice of religious prostitution, you keep my Sabbaths and you reverence my sanctuary. You come together and you know my law. That's the Sabbath. Remember, it's a holy assembly. It's a holy convocation. You're supposed to be together and learning of God. And pair that with, don't you dare have a temple prostitute at my tabernacle. Don't you dare. So we can't add that in, even though we do get some references to it occasionally throughout Samuel and the Kings. Eli's time kind of gets pretty close to that at the beginning of 1 Samuel. Some of the comments about how his sons behave with the women that come kind of gets a little close to it without, if I remember correctly, fully saying that they are temple prostitutes or at that time tabernacle prostitutes, but it's moving that way, definitely. Any comments before we get the last section on the religious stuff?
We read about they were nothing was done because they didn't have two witnesses. Like, I'm thinking of Judah and his daughter-in-law.
Probably. Well, Judah with his daughter-in-law is before law of Moses, so that's a little bit of a separate issue. But more than likely, yeah, it's just they don't have the witnesses. It happened within the city walls, or it happened out in the field, or nobody knew about it till later. Yeah. Ashley?
You know, is 27 why the devout youths don't cut the edges?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that where that comes from?
Yeah, that's where that comes from. Even today, they don't mar the edges of the beard. Yeah. Do you have a comment? I saw a whole bunch of hands move right when I asked for comments, and so I'm not really sure where all the hands were. Okay. The last one in 31, do not turn to mediums or necromancers, do not seek them out, and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Who is the most famous person to go and consult a medium or necromancer? Saul. And it worked. Which terrified a lot of people in that story. And made one very angry spirit. Very angry spirit. So it's a very interesting story in and of itself. But you can't turn to them, even though you can kind of see that we're getting away from idolatry itself. We've got very much what idolatrous priests did in 26, 27, and 28. We're getting towards what if you're not a priest And we're getting even further to what if you're just some hedge witch in the countryside who says that she can practice necromancy or something of the like. So we're getting further and further away from organized religion, and God says, you got to stay away from all of it. I am the Lord your God. You just stay with me. Any comments before we go further? Okay. Last ones here, we're getting back towards interpersonal relationships. The first one, you shall stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man. You shall fear your God, I am the Lord. Respecting of your elders, whether they are your parents or not. In 33, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Entering in and conquering is a different period than having conquered. He makes a distinction here. Entering in and conquering, they're to kill every single person. Everything gone. They fail at that, but that was the intention. But once they're in the land, you're going to have people coming and through. You can't live there in this little smidgen of the Fertile Crescent and kill every trade van that comes through. Like, that's just not going to work. So you've got to have a way to deal with them. Already we've seen that any stranger or sojourner that travels through your land is subject to the law of God. We've already seen that. And now you are subject to treat them as if they are just simply a native amongst you. Now, that's not saying treat them with, just let them have free reign. That's not really his point. His point is to be kind, to be hospitable, and to take care of them, like we've already seen. Not to just simply say, well, you're a person traveling through Judah. You must be of the tribe of Judah now, so now my daughters can marry you. That's not his point. That's not what God was intending with that verse. Any comments on those two sections there before we go a little further? Yeah.
Would that apply to the people of Canaan that were not taken out when Joshua went through there? Would they still have to treat them well, or would they not?
Some of them, yes. Some of them get subjugated and become a subject nation, though even that kind of fades with time. But they are still supposed to treat them well. Yeah, they're not supposed to just kill them because they happen to see them on the road. Okay, 35. You shall do no wrong in judgment, in measure of length, or weight, or quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, a just hin. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and you shall observe all my statutes and all my rules, and do them. I am the Lord. In business, you are to be trustworthy. When you measure out the yard, you measured out the yard. Well, it's a cubit, but still. When you measure out the grain, you measure it at the appropriate weight value or quantity value, whatever you're happening to be using. You can't mistreat them just because they're strangers. You can't mistreat them just because they're poor. You can't mistreat them just because they're rich. You just do what you're supposed to do. Any thoughts on anything we've talked about so far in 19? Yeah.
You know why in verse 32, after it says, honor the aged, and you shall revere your God, I am the Lord? Because there are other verses that end with, I am the Lord, but not with, and you shall revere your God, and then I am the Lord.
I think it's the mentality associated with that one. The fear of the Lord is the same fear that you're giving to this older individual who should know better. Like, they should be guiding you. They should be leading. They should be the elders at the gates. Therefore, to follow them would be very similar. So I think he's pairing the two together. Same as when he did at the very first verses. In the first things he says in verse 3 is, every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. He's pairing these together as well. The Sabbaths, the holy convocations, revering your father and mother who should have brought you up in the knowledge of the Lord, honoring the old individuals, the gray head, fearing the Lord, paired together as well. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's look at 20. So chapter 20, verses 1 through 9 here. We'll hit verse 1 through 5 first. The Lord said to Moses, saying, say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I myself will set my face against that man and will cut him off from among his people, because he has given one of his children to Molech to make my sanctuary unclean and to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to that man when he gives one of his children to Molech, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his clan, and I will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him in whoring after Molech. Molech is set up as worse in God's eyes. You're still wrong for worshiping Baal or Asherah, but Baal or Asherah, generally speaking, do not require children to be sacrificed. But almost exclusively throughout the ancient world and throughout the Bible, certainly, Molech is. If you are a servant of Molech, humans are being offered at some point. And so to give your child to Molech, God says, is one of the pinnacle of wrongnesses. We've got them interacting somewhat with idolatry in the last chapter, but he doesn't say to kill them, he just says to stop. Don't do these things. But this time he's very clear. He says, you shall put them to death. In fact, he goes so far as to say, who is supposed to be doing it? That was good timing. So who is supposed to be doing this? The people. Not the priests, not the soldiers, not the king, not the judge. But if you are just a person, and you are walking along and you see this happening, you need to get people together and stone them. It's your responsibility. It's not waiting for the leadership to decide. It's you. You know what this looks like. You know what somebody burning a child looks like. That's hard to misinterpret, right? Because they don't burn their children when they're dead. They bury them. They're Jews. That's how they deal with that. So no one should ever be burning a corpse. Therefore, you stone them. He goes further and he says in verse 3, I myself will set my face against that man and cut him off from among his people. Meaning that as soon as this is happening, God has already made a distinction. Therefore, when you come along and you see this or you learn of this, God has already made the judgment. You're following his commands at this point. But he goes a little bit further. What does he say is going to happen if some of the people choose not to stone? Maybe the family knows about it and they decide we're not going to stone him. Yeah, he says, I'm going to take care of it. And we're going to have them all go out. That whole family or clan or however that knowledge has spread, God says, I'll set my face against them. I will cut them off. I will cut off everyone who follows after Molech. Now, I want to go back to verse 3. The reason behind this is interesting, isn't it? Because he says, you have given one of your children to Molech, but what does he say became unclean? His sanctuary. We call that what? The tabernacle. I heard a muttering. Or the temple when we finally get to that point. So, when we read through the consecration day, or the consecration of the tabernacle, and we read through Day of Atonement, and then we made the connections there, talking about how this is made separate, this is made holy, and on Day of Atonement, the first things that have to happen is the priest has to take care of himself, but then he has to take care of the tabernacle because the people have made it unclean. That's what we're getting at here. This is one of those times when God is super clear. When you sin over there in the land of Asher, way away from anywhere where there's a tabernacle or a temple, you have made my sanctuary to be unclean. Because you are mine. And what the common people do reflects on their king. And their king has to respond. And the king of the Jews is God. Any comments anybody has? Yeah.
Is it saying here, or maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, that if you close your eyes to sin, you're guilty of sin? Is that right?
In this case, yes. If you do not respond to the Molech sin specifically, you are guilty and cut off as well. Other passages describe it differently. So some sins require your actions and some do not under the law of Moses. But this is one that requires the action. Okay, let's get the last little section there. Verse 6. If a person turns to mediums and necromancers, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. Keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. For anyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father and or his mother. His blood is upon him. Okay. This last section here is those fringe rules. The mediums, the necromancers, the wizards, the warlocks, those individuals we're talking about here. They're on the outside. They're not necessarily a part of organized religions, but they still claim to have power. If you go after these ideals, these ideas, these people, you will be cut off by God. He warns them to separate themselves by consecrating themselves and being holy, following after his statutes. He moves back to his original comments when he talks about anyone cursing his father or his mother will be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother. His blood is upon him. He's going back to that idea of bringing magic into this discussion. It's not simply the idea of I'm a child and I'm like, you guys are the worst. That's not cursing your parents. Cursing your parents is going to a medium or a necromancer in this context and asking them, please put a curse on them. Please put an ending on them. Please speak ill against them. Please bring the spirits in to make things happen terribly for them. So it's a great bookend, is that we've got over here, we've got this wonderful ending of don't curse your parents, and we started with revere your parents and keep the Sabbaths. Any comments? Now, weeks from now, I can't say too many weeks because I think I only have 3 more after tonight. We're going to be talking about a man who is caught blaspheming and cursing and so forth and so on. And we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to that point. But there's a specific example in Leviticus that we will get to. All right. Any thoughts on what we've discussed? Yeah.
Is he saying there, if you do these things, that's good, that's what I want you to do. But it's still God that makes you holy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Following after the rules makes you obedient to God. And on Day of Atonement, you still say, we're still unclean. We still failed to be holy. Add verse 27 in there. I almost forgot to throw it in there. A man or a woman who is a medium or a necromancer shall surely be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. God has already cut them off. You're just following the command. Yeah.
Child sacrifice to Molech or Chemosh, who comes along later. Just kind of pondering this idea about why are the people brought in as part of the punishment? Two things, I guess. I guess unlike worship to Baal, where you're just sacrificing your ox, the heritage of people are part of the community. So why would the community be brought in? It's because someone from the community has been killed. What do you think about that line of reasoning?
It matches very similarly to some of the laws on murder, where the family responds to it because there is that impact upon the family. I think you're right. I think when we see God be specific and he says the community, the people do the stoning, it is because this is something the community needs to pay more attention to. It's not something that the family can hush up. It's not something the priest can just take care of in private. It's something that is going to be told and known because this has happened.
The worship of Molech is never described in Scripture other than, there's a child sacrifice.
Yeah.
But from what I've read, it was a very horrific scene. It's a communal scene, lots of music. Some people theorize that the music was to hide the screams of the children as they're put into the fiery altar. Lots of sex, lots of wine, to kind of inhibit any paternal ties or anything.
Yeah.
So it is a communal affair. unlike what some of the other worship could have been, even though
Yeah.
it was, we know it was, it didn't have to be.
Baal and Asherah frequently are solitary. They can be hidden.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you can settle them.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to worry. The one other thing though, Jeremiah accuses the Israelites, or God through Jeremiah says, you've erected the altar of Baal, you have sacrificed your children to Molech. This never entered my mind. So I wonder if by the time of Jeremiah, if people were saying, this is what Yahweh wants. This is what he has commanded. Even though we know from this that he had not commanded.
I definitely agree. You read the Chronicles and Kings, and you totally can see them fall down into the, when they make their Reformation moments. It talks about this one, reformed and did away with a whole bunch of stuff, but they still kept doing other things, and that's why, is that they didn't know God didn't want that anymore. To the point that at one point they moved the altar in the temple to put more altars and things in there, so then the next generation is going to think that's normal. Yeah. Okay, we got like 3 minutes. Go to chapter 12. We've already discussed chapter 12, so I'm just going to remind you of that because we discussed it way back when we went through the sin offering. This is the chapter on childbirth. Principles are very simple. If a woman gives birth to a male, she is ritually unclean 7 days. At that time, he is then circumcised on the 8th, and then she is in the blood of her purifying for 33. So the blood of her purifying refers to the normal practice of her monthly cycle. That's kind of how it's viewed. It's not terrible. It just is what it is. If it's a female child, she's unclean for 2 weeks, and then she's in the blood of her purifying for 66 days beyond that. Just because those have different impacts. If someone encounters her while she's unclean is different than if he encounters her while she is on her monthly cycle. Those are different problems going on. That's why God makes those distinctions. And in chapter 15, I think we're going to talk about those distinctions, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that now. With childbirth, at the end of the days of purifying, she is commanded to bring sacrifices. And this is really the only time that I remember in all of Leviticus where a woman is commanded to bring the sacrifice. Notice it says in verse 6, when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. He will then offer it as he's supposed to. She will then be clean from her flow of blood. This is the law for she who bears a child, male or female. If she can't afford the lamb, 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons are enough to suffice, 1 for a burnt offering and 1 for a sin offering. What is the significance of the fact that all that is required for a sin offering is the birds? What do you think? Could have required a goat. Why only birds? Okay, they're easier to find. Definitely with that second point down there, verse 9, if she can't afford it, birds are definitely cheaper. But think about the level of importance here that God is placing. God says, you are unclean. Sometimes that requires a large animal. But you were pregnant and you gave birth. God views that uncleanness differently. And so he says, you're unclean and you need to rejoin society, but you just gave birth. It's not like you went out and you did something to become unclean. You did exactly what I commanded you to do. You had a child. And so God makes it as least burdensome as he can for her to come back from this. Because she's right. But she still is ritually unclean. She has to rejoin the group at the end of this. And so there has to be sacrifices for that. So he has a sin and he has a burnt offering. The sin offering removes her uncleanness, and the burnt offering is her worship restored to God. Any thoughts on that?
And they're dispersed many miles from Jerusalem. How could they do that?
You travel. You travel.
Out to the temple?
I would say so. If she's going to do these sacrifices, she's got to be where the sacrifices are done. I think centrally the tabernacle is located, but when the temple gets built, it's very much in the south. Yeah. Did I see your hand, Ben? Or just movement? Okay, then you don't get to comment.
So we're talking about all this ritualistic stuff, and it's specified on the 8th day of his flesh, the foreskin shall be circumcised. I know that originally when the original covenant was made, Abraham just took care of that with him and his servants. Did there reach a point where that was so ceremonial that like the priests are the ones that are handling it, or how did I didn't know if it was anywhere was specified beyond. Like I said, I know the very first Abraham just took care of it, but I didn't
Moses
know.
and Zipporah, she just takes care of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anybody else know?
The reason for the 8th day is because the clotting mechanisms in the baby's body are not active until about the 8th day.
Yeah, I do know that part. Yeah. But I don't know the answer to your question. Whether or not it becomes a family event or they go, I hesitate to say that they go to the tabernacle or the temple because there's a lot of uncleanness going on right there. And they don't take care of that uncleanness, at least not here in Leviticus. It's just circumcision. So that's my only hesitation. But I don't know. Yeah.
On the 8th day to be circumcised.
Yeah. Yeah.
A priest that was born with some type of defect, there's no fault of his own or whatsoever, he couldn't make the offering.
Right.
But a priest that didn't have any defects, he can make an offering.
Yes.
Well, did that make them holier than the rest of them?
Yes.
It seems like it does.
Yes. Yeah, because they are perfect. And with God's priesthood, those who do the work are perfect. Their behavior must be perfect. Their marriages are perfect. Their sacrificing style is perfect. Their garb is perfect. Their bodies are perfect. Anytime that they become imperfect, they can no longer do the work. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts anybody has? Okay. Next time we're going to get into 13 and 14 and maybe 15 because I'm about a chapter behind now for my schedule. But I think that'll be okay. So read 13, 14, and 15. We'll get through leprosy, and we'll get into the discharges. Thank you.